In this lecture, we'll begin to explore the first 18 chapters of the book of Exodus. Initially, we'll give some overview for the entire book in terms of the three locales where it transpires. The first 13 chapters take place in the land of Egypt itself. Chapter 14, they're leaving Egypt, making their way to Mount Sinai, so that zone 14 to 18, in transit. By chapter 19, they have reached Mount Sinai, and the remaining chapters of Exodus take place there. Let's zero in on some of these features just a bit more, still by way of overview. Grouping all first 18 chapters together, deliverance from Egypt and the journey, and now focusing in on 19 and following, we find 19 through 24 is where the covenant is formed at Sinai. That's very, very pivotal. When the covenant is ratified, is concluded in 24, then follow the instructions for how Israel is to build the tabernacle and to perform the ritual associated with it. Breach and renewal of the covenant takes place next, interrupting the giving of the instructions for tabernacle construction and the actual construction of the tabernacle. Construction then picks up in chapter 35 and continues through the end of Exodus, culminating in God moving into the tabernacle that they have built for him in chapter 40. We'll follow with our customary three aspects or three lenses of exploring the text, first literary, then historical, finally moving to theological concepts. Literary first, then. We'll visit these various points in turn. First, how does the book of Exodus relate to material before and material after? Second, what is the quality of the actual textual transmission? Third, authorship. Fourth, when may this have been written? Fifth, genre. Sixth, exploring one particular theme that becomes prominent from a literary viewpoint due to its repetition. And finally, zeroing in on the name of God that he reveals and its meaning. First literary insight then, connection with adjacent materials before Exodus and after Exodus. Before Exodus, we have the names of the patriarchs, particularly the family. That closes the book of Genesis as Jacob issues a blessing, in particular in Genesis 49, for his various sons. Early in Exodus, we find these sons listed again, so a fairly close linkage. What about the way in which Exodus connects with Leviticus and successive books? Notice that construction of the tabernacle is very prominent, so much so that it's listed in the design and then the fulfillment of it in Exodus. And when we get to Leviticus, we encounter activities that are performed at that tabernacle. Think in particular of the first 5 chapters that outline the kind of sacrifices and offerings that are to be presented at the bronze altar. That has meaning because the previous book, that is Exodus, has shown us how to build that altar. Exodus also has connection with Deuteronomy because Deuteronomy will recap the events of the Exodus, even to the extent of presenting the Decalogue once again, the 10 Commandments. These insights are presented, incidentally, by Terence Frentheim in his article in the Dictionary of the Old Testament, Pentateuch. Concerning the quality of textual transmission, we can observe that the book of Exodus, as noted by Durham, is remarkably free of serious textual difficulty. What this means is that as we read the Hebrew of the book of Exodus, it reads quite smoothly. You may be wondering, well, are there parts of the Hebrew Bible that are unlike that? And the answer would be yes. The first and second books of Samuel have more textual difficulties, places where the text of the Hebrew does not read as smoothly. This is not as evident from the English because the translators and editors have been careful to smooth things out. But in the book of Exodus, there are even less of these original sort of problems or difficulties. It may be that this is the result of the book of Exodus being highly used and standardized in its use in the Jewish community. And now we turn to the issue of authorship. Various theories we may find concerning this, one of which is Moses' involvement. Regarding Moses' involvement, be aware that in chapter 17 we have mention of an instruction to Moses to record one particular feature concerning the encounter with Amalek. In chapter 24 we have a record that Moses wrote down what the Lord had said to him concerning the covenant. Sometimes the Pentateuch as a whole, not just Exodus, but the Pentateuch as a whole, is labeled as the book of Moses. We want to acknowledge that this sort of attribution is not contained within the Pentateuch, but rather was given to this book, this collection of 5, later on by tradition. Another view of the authorship of Exodus has to do with the possibility that various sources have been woven together. Sources such as the Yahwistic, the Elohistic, the priestly, and the nomadic. As you may have gathered from other reading, in short then, the Yahwistic source is one thought to be characterized by more frequent reference to God by the name Yahweh, often rendered Lord in small caps, than referring to God by other titles. Elohistic, characterized by reference to God by the term Elohim, generally rendered God. Priestly, this would be a source that gives primary interest to things such as calendar and season, sacrificial or liturgical custom or ceremony, and genealogy. The calendar and season would be of value to priests because they need to know when the Sabbath starts and stops. They need to know when the new moon occurs for various festival or observations. They need to know when is time for the particular festivals, the annual festivals. Genealogy would be of interest to priestly tradition because they need to know who is qualified to serve in the priesthood. One must be able to trace their genealogy, their lineage, to the Levite tribe, and more particularly then the tribe of Aaron for the high priest and so forth. The nomadic source is not spoken of too often by source critics, but it would have to do with a group of people within Israel who were interested in nomadic traditions, and they may have been responsible for keeping the record of some of the wanderings of Israel. You can study these more in depth with textbooks associated with this course or with theological dictionaries, such as the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament. Brevard Childs has responded to the source critical trends by cautioning us against atomizing or dividing the text to the extent that we miss the cohesive theological message. His comment would be, since the text has been provided to us in its final form by the faith community, initially the Jewish community, and now together with the Christian community, we need to take that final form seriously and not be excessively hung up on places where there are differences. Final comments concerning the date of composition. Some parts may well be as early as Moses' era, and given that literacy was in place long before Moses' time in the Egypt where he grew up and was trained, the likelihood that he indeed was recording these events is very reasonable, in my opinion. On the other hand, those who find the source critical approach to provide more solutions for their understanding of the authorship will point out the theories that place authorship as late as the 10th century, ranging further down to the 5th century BC, with the implication that this material was finally edited and pulled together in the period of the exile of the southern kingdom. We'll turn now to genre. What are the various literary styles that are contained within the book of Exodus? We have narrative, we have law code, we have poetry. Consider narrative, a couple of different flavors or styles within narrative. Moses' call occupying chapters 2 through 5. And then a slightly different subgenre within narrative would be typified by this cycle of 10 plagues, the fact that one occurs after another. Law code can easily be found in the case of the Decalogue in chapter 20. And then what's come to be called the covenant code spans parts of chapter 20 through 23, and that is God stipulating how persons should behave if they are serious about being in covenant relationship with Him. Later readers have termed this the covenant code for behavior if you wish to be in covenant with Him. As mentioned earlier, there is actually some poetry within Exodus, and we have in mind here the account of the Song of Moses celebrating victory over the Egyptians. This occurs in chapter 15, and it's of particular interest to us because the kind of Hebrew that's contained here, preserved here, is earlier. Some of the expressions are earlier, and this is most likely one of the earliest Hebrew records. Judges 5 is similar in that it's a poem, and it preserves some archaic forms. It's the Song of Deborah. It's also worth observing that we find within Exodus a blend of liturgy and history. If you've already been reading in the material, you will recognize this fact. For example, we move through the call of Moses after his birth narratives. We have the call narratives. And then we move into the plagues. And then right on the edge of the Passover, we encounter some liturgy or some instruction for how to commemorate this event in future years. For God instructs them to not forget this, but to reenact it by a ceremonial meal, imitating the meal that they enjoyed before leaving Egypt. So we have this vacillating or alternating between narrative, that is history, and then instructions for liturgy, for how to carry on certain ceremonies, memorials. I like what Terence Frentheim has said in his Dictionary of the Old Testament Pentateuch article when he says the historical event, that is the narrative portions, are presented like it's part of a liturgy, like it's part of a commemorative retelling, not simply a historical record. And now, continuing with literary context, I'd like to take up the idea of a literary theme. As you've been reading in Exodus, I wonder if you've noticed the various incidents where there is mention of a son or some male figure who has been rescued. Pause the video for a moment and just for fun, see how many you can think of. I wonder what you came up with. Did you recall that the midwives, Puah and Shiphrah, were busy about the business of rescuing infant Hebrew boys? Pharaoh said, if it's a boy, infanticide. I want that child killed. But the midwives worked in such a fashion as to protect those sons. They were rescuers. Moses' mother, whom we later learn has the name Yocheved in chapter 2, preserves her son against the Pharaoh's command. And then Pharaoh's daughter comes and rescues baby Moses. We want to recognize this as an incidence of reversal, literary reversal. That is to say, here comes a figure who behaves in such a fashion that we would not expect. This is part of the court from which has issued the edict for the death of all these children, and yet someone from that very court acts in the opposite, a reverse fashion. As we encounter a literary device like reversal, We want to be aware of how it functions, the sense of surprise that it introduces. By identifying this as a literary device, I am not suggesting that it's fictitious, that it's the contriving of an editor, an author. I'm simply saying it was included. It was part of the story that the author remembered and wanted to be preserved, and it has this surprise effect of deliverance underscored because it's coming from an unexpected source. We could include Moses early on as one who rescues some Israelite fellow, a male figure, unnamed. But this plan goes awry, doesn't it? In the process of rescuing an Israelite, and he kills an Egyptian, and his efforts to help reconcile some contention between two Israelites on a subsequent event, then raises the specter of him having murdered an Egyptian, and Moses winds up running for his life, fleeing Pharaoh. We find Zipporah, who then at this point is the wife of Moses. She winds up rescuing Moses. Or is it perhaps Gershom, their son, whom she rescues? The text is a little bit vague in this point. And as we take this concept of the rescue of a son to a higher level, we discover God identifies Israel as his son. Here's a case where a theme that's operating on a literal level then moves to a grander figurative level. So we hear him instructing Moses to say to Pharaoh, quote, "Let my son go," referring to the nation of Israel, "that he may worship me." When we come to the Passover event then, and now we're thinking of the first Passover, which was preceding the curse, the plague rather, against the firstborn, we see the Passover as rescuing the Israelite firstborn sons. And when Pharaoh realized how strong was the God of Israel and what a high price he was paying for resisting, then the Passover and the death of the firstborn immediately following led to the rescue, the release of the Israelite nation, not just the firstborn sons, but now the nation whom God has identified as his son. That led to a principle, a statute, so that each firstborn, whether the sons within a family or animals in the herds or flocks, would be considered as God's special possession. And here is a case where we have the narrative and then a piece of instruction. Here's the instruction in chapter 13. It envisions a child asking his father, what's going on here as far as dedication of the firstborn to God? And the father is to explain. When Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord killed every firstborn in Egypt, both man and animal. This is why I sacrifice to the Lord the first male offspring of every womb. And this is why I redeem each of my firstborn sons. I've appreciated what Brevard Childs in his commentary on Exodus has said about this business of recognizing Israel as God's son. Childs writes, the conflict that is between Pharaoh and God, the conflict is over paternal power. And in the claim of the firstborn, the God of Israel and the king of Egypt have clashed in a head-on encounter. This is, I think, a very apt summary of the conflict that we see, the struggle, the tug-of-war between God's command to let his people go and Pharaoh's resistance of it. Pharaoh says, I have power over these people, and God says, nothing doing, this is my son. I'm going to bring you to a point where you will have to let him go. It's interesting to note the language that's used. And here we're concentrating on a particular verb that'll show up later in this lecture, The verb in Hebrew is avad, and it means to serve, but it can also mean to worship. The king of Egypt, is saying, "It is I whom they must serve. I am their master." But God is saying, "I am commanding you, Pharaoh, to let them go so that they may serve or worship me." Let's now turn our attention to the question of what does that name mean that God divulged to Moses as part of his call in chapter 3. The name literally is rendered "I am who I am" in full form, and then just "I am" in short form. We do want to keep in mind, as we've seen earlier, particularly with the disclosure of Jacob's name to the heavenly wrestler, that process, issuing a name, gave access to a person's character. So, as God was giving this name, disclosing it to Moses, he was, in a measure, giving Moses access to God's character. Let's look at some of the possible ways to understand this. One has been offered by a scholar by the name of Haupt, and he infers that the name "I am who I am" employs a particular verbal stem within Hebrew known as the Hiphil stem, which characteristically brings a tone of causation into it. So if the basic verb is "to be," and you thrust it into the Hiphil stem, then it takes on the meaning "I cause to be." You may encounter this theory in your reading. I must confess that in my analysis of the Hebrew of this, I haven't been persuaded that it actually is a Hiphil, but this is one of the theories that's been put forth. One that I find more intriguing and would encourage you to strongly consider has been put forth by Brevard Childs, and it has to do with detecting in this expression of God's name a level of intensity that would not be in a simpler Hebrew expression. You'll notice in the name, "I am that I am," we have defining something in terms of itself. You might think of it in mathematics as the identity principle. That's generally represented as A equals A, defining A in terms of A. Childs derives from this a sense that it expresses totality or intensity. What he's going to do next is take us to a different part of the Bible in which we find that same sort of A equals A, or A is parallel to A. Notice this example coming from Exodus 33. This is in the Golden Calf Rebellion, and God is telling how his behavior will be unfolded. He says, "I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious." Notice that identity. "And will show mercy on whom I will show mercy." What Childs understands this to mean is, when I come to a point, I as God come to a point of being gracious, I will indeed be gracious. I will be overwhelmingly gracious. I will be intensively gracious. And when I come about to show mercy, I will show mercy just exponentially. If we bring that connotation back into the "I am who I am," then it would lead to this connotation: I am indeed he who exists, or I am he who is genuine, is authentic, who truly exists, and I exist in, you can fill in whatever helps you make this more intensive. I exist in rippling power. I exist in an undeniable fashion. I exist and I am more genuine than anything around me. I am the most genuine, the most authentic, the most present of any reality you may conceive. There's one last definition or connotation that is worth considering, and that is as follows. If A is identified or defined in terms of A, then that might be a way of saying the only way to define that article is in terms of itself. It is incomparable. If God is saying, "I am," And what I am is I myself. He is not inserting any lesser thing, any inferior or inadequate representation of himself as the definition of his identity. It's like saying, I exist and there is nothing like me. Interestingly, we find that kind of language in the theology of Israel from time to time. I'm thinking now of a similar name which some carry. The name Michael, Michael, means who is like God. It's not using the Yahweh name, but it is a similar sentiment that God is incomparable. When we bring this awareness of God's name, meaning I truly exist, or I exist and there is none like me, when we bring that into one particular episode within Exodus, it has a very powerful fallout or consequence. I'm thinking of Moses' first encounter with Pharaoh. It takes place in Exodus chapter 5. He first appears before Pharaoh. He instructs him that the Lord, and that is this I am, is commanding Pharaoh to let his people go. Pharaoh responds in this way. Number one, who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? He is saying, I know of no God in my pantheon who goes by the name Yahweh, as we suppose his name may have been pronounced, or the Lord, or reverentially pronounced Adonai in typical Jewish practice. Who is Adonai that I should obey him and let Israel go? This God is not in my pantheon. He's a nobody to me. And he continues, secondly, I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go. I simply will not. It's interesting that he has accurately identified the Lord by this special name, the I am name. If we consider the meaning of the name Lord in this context, he is naming the God who says, I intensively exist. But Pharaoh is saying, as far as I'm concerned, I don't think he does exist. I don't think that the God who intensively exists. I don't know him. But as you know the end of this story, by the time the I am, the I really exist God, is done with Pharaoh, he is persuaded that that God is true to his name. He truly does exist. This next point in the Cyan block is just a conjecture on my part. This mighty Pharaoh, this haughty Pharaoh, who says he does not know God, I wonder if his unknowing might have influenced the author to let that Pharaoh languish in namelessness. You don't know the Lord, and we're going to leave you as an unknown monarch, a no-name monarch in our story. By the way, we'll come back to that fact later in the lecture. We'll break the video at this point. The next part will deal with historical insights from the first 18 chapters of Exodus.